Hello one and all, and welcome back to Create Ball, where, yeah, I realize it kinda seems like I'm going through an identity crisis for the channel, just due to the sudden broadness in video topics. Like, one week I'm talking about koalas, then it's a review, then it's back to the classic story videos, then it's a drawing video, and now it's another review. But, you know what? That's fine. I just finished watching a truly amazing show, and I'm gonna talk about it. The End of the Effing World, a show about two troubled teenagers that fall in love and run away together. This is the only description I had of the show before I started watching it, and at hearing this, I made two mistakes. First, I underestimated the use of the word troubled, and second, I overestimated how much of a love story it would be, because they're only actually in love for like 4 episodes. If you haven't seen the show and have no interest in watching it, first of all, you're wrong. Go watch it. And secondly, I'm not going to spoil anything too major until a certain point of the video, which I'll be sure to warn you about. The story starts off with a self-diagnosed psychopath named James deciding to run away and pretend to fall in love with a girl called Alyssa, so he can murder her. What can I say? He's quite the romantic. It turns out that James isn't a psychopath, and as such, his character arc is actually really interesting. But before we talk about the arcs as a whole, let's just talk about how both of the main characters begin. In the first 3 episodes, but especially episode 1, the interactions between Alyssa and James are cold, awkward, and unnatural. Usually, this would imply bad writing, but in this case, it's the exact opposite, since that's the point of the characters, and it's done really well. Other than just seeming emotionally damaged, they both have a few other problems as well. James, for example, just kind of lets stuff happen. Like, he only runs away with Alyssa in the first place because he figures that he isn't in a rush and he can just kill her later. And Alyssa is a bit overbearing and opinionated. Then, after episodes 3, we start seeing actual growth in their characters. James gains the ability to feel emotion, Alyssa becomes a bit kinder, and both of them become more comfortable with the other one. This one scene at the end of episode 6 is just pure genius. For the entire show, we've been receiving inner dialogue from James and Alyssa, showing us how they actually feel about something. Then, at the end of episode 6, Alyssa thinks to herself, "I'm scared," then turns to James and tells him exactly that. It's a small detail, so small, in fact, but it's the first time that one of them has told the other one exactly what they were thinking, and it is beautiful. And remember, most impressive of all, they started as 2 people that basically just fell in love through obligation, and because James wanted to murder Alyssa, and yet, just 6 episodes later, they're actually being genuine. And the character arc doesn't feel at all rushed, either. Guys, this is a good show. Moving away from James and Alyssa's character arcs, the show also has a lot of violence and taboo subject matter, but not because it thinks it's all cool and edgy because of it, but because it's actually important to the show's story, at least in season 1. Also, by the way, it's spoiler time. I won't give proper context, so these aren't really spoilers yet, but it'll just be confusing if you haven't seen the show. I think overall, season 2 is as well written as season 1, but there are a few scenes here and there that are just kind of weird and uncomfortable. I'm referring specifically to the scene with the motel manager. Sure, there were certainly scenes like that in season 1, but the difference is that those scenes were actually important to the season as a whole, and the people involved felt like real people. Clive and the old man seem real. Absolutely terrible trash human beings, sure, but they seem like real trash human beings. The motel manager here doesn't really convince me that he's behaving like an actual person would, and the scenes with him don't even matter to the actual plot. He didn't really need to die. His murder added next to nothing to the plot. The policeman in episode 7 wasn't there because of the motel guy's murder. He was there because James called the cops. It feels like the scene was added just to be uncomfortable, which is something that never happened in season 1. In season 1, terrible things definitely happened, but it never dwelled on them. The scene with the old man in episode 2 was about 30 seconds long, and the scene with Clive is only slightly longer, being just over a minute. Those were both more important to the season than the motel guy. But despite that, the motel guy scene is longer, at 2 minutes. Which I know isn't that long, but I think it's still worth mentioning, considering a scene that literally changed the entire course of the season is half as long as this throwaway scene that was added, from what I can guess, for the sole purpose of being uncomfortable. But yeah, like I said, other than those occasional weird bits, Season 2 is written as well as Season 1, even though I didn't like it as much. Now you might be asking, why didn't I like it as much if it was, at least according to me, just as well written? Well, I think it's mostly about your personal preference. Like I said, in Season 1, bad things happened, but it didn't dwell on it. And there were plenty of moments of levity to help lighten the mood. Season 2, on the other hand, is just one bad thing after another. The relationship between James and Alyssa is at its lowest, Alyssa is getting married, James's dad is dead, and everything is terrible. It feels like a perpetual kick to the crotch for 8 episodes, but it actually adds up to create my favorite moment in the entire show. Season 2, Episode 7. Bonnie, who is the season's main antagonist and is out to avenge the death of Clive, catches James and Alyssa in a cafe. After a very tense scene of James and Alyssa trying to convince Bonnie not to kill them, this happens.
You might think you don't have a chance, but you do.
This turns out to be just a daydream and not real, which would usually really annoy me, since I hate fake-out deaths, but this was the first time that it's actually worked for me, and I think I know why. If almost anybody else was the writer for this show, they would have made an incredibly tense scene, have the fake-out death, which would annoy me, and then move on. Instead, the writers made a fairly intense scene at the end of an incredibly intense season. So at this point, especially if you binge-watched the season like me, you've started carrying around all this stress from everything that's been happening in the show. From Alyssa's wedding, to James's letter, to the fact that you just want these two to be together and happy again. It's all very stressful. Then, at the most stressful point in the series, when these two characters that you have hopefully grown to love are held at gunpoint, they pull the trigger. I don't know if I'm just weird, or if this is the reaction that the writers wanted, but literally the only relief I felt throughout all of Season 2 was at this moment. As I said, I watched it all in one sitting, and this scene was the first time that I actually relaxed in my chair. The entire rest of the time, I sat up, almost rising from the chair, just because of how stressful it was. The show is really good, guys. I think what I love most about it is twofold. First, I love the character arcs. In Season 1, they go from being pretty bad people to basically good people. But then, in Season 2, which I know I didn't talk about the specifics of very much, they go back to bad people. Not for any arbitrary reason, but because they both lost the person that made them change in the first place, and eventually they just fell back into their old habits. Secondly, I love that Season 1 ends as a tragic love story, with James getting shot to save Alyssa. But then, in Season 2, we get to see the fallout of that, with James and Alyssa being pulled away from each other, and it becomes excruciatingly awkward between them. What I assume is the end of the series is just, yeah, we love each other, but there's also a bunch of stuff we have to work out before this could work. Which I think is probably a more fitting end to these two characters, which is sad, but it's not hopeless. Anyway, until next time, don't die. Sayonara.